Welcome everyone to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I am your host, Jeff Cantor, along with Charles Froman. We do want to remind you we're sponsored by the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, and we are definitely the disruptors intersection. We are recording all these for posterity, so you'll be able to see these later. We also feature another channel, which is focused on the free market and cash patients, and we'd encourage you to check out some past episodes or subscribe to that. And definitely you want to visit the website. These are two ways to get to the exact same place and to take a quick detour there. This is the site itself. There's a lot of things to check out when you hover over it. What's kind of important over the home area is the webinars tab, which is pertinent to today, but also very importantly is continuing the conversation. So if you click on that, this takes you to the follow-up, because at the beginning, this thing really gets the ball rolling, and then you really want to start to dig in with these people to help further their cause or get more involved, and this is your way to do it. We also feature under the Freedom tab a bunch of organizations that are fighting for freedom. We're starting out with some action items you should take advantage of and work on. Learn about some of these operations themselves. And then also at the Marketplace, where we begin to curate some very unique things that are not like overwhelming with a lot of stuff in there, but it's a couple of real key things and some stuff that's pretty important, as you'll see, as things are happening right now. But then again, if you hover over home and you click on webinars, you end up where we are today. So let's whip down here for a minute, and here's a description of the two that occur today. A little further is who's coming up. And again, very importantly, for first of the week, you come back here, and at any one of these links, you'll find the various videos from today. But let's find out who is up for today's agenda, and I'm going to have Charles take over right about now.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and Nick, welcome back. It's great to have Nick update us on these petty tyrants governing the 50 states. And in a state like mine, in Virginia, as the swarm of bureaucrats up near DC have taken over our state, and now we're losing our rights and money. We had some good politicians this past winter and last September in a special session try to limit the extent to which governors can issue these emergency orders for pandemics. And it's all over the news. It's become political. Is Ron DeSantis the next Republican nominee for president because he's standing up to Fauci and his friend Gates against these draconian orders? And is he even going to forbid vaccine passports? Which other Republican governors are going to follow suit and open up, and which governors don't have any pressure from the state legislatures at all to limit the extent to which they can shut down so-called non-essential businesses, keep capacities low in restaurants, or now, with Governor Cuomo, or Los Angeles's school board and other markets, I'm sure, require a passport not only to enter a crowded arena, or in the future to fly, or to work in a hospital or nursing home, or teach. Are you going to have that vaccine passport to regain some of your normal activities? So that's a new fight that's going to be upon us, and some folks are kind of cavalier about it. Sure, let's just have that passport so we can go back to normal, and let's reopen based on that. I think that will create division, even among those on the right, some of whom are just so desperate for things to reopen that they'll accept the passport. And then the very fast-growing health freedom movement is not going to be happy about that. Half the world is suspicious about these vaccines. A good 30% in the latest Pew poll. Same percentage of health professionals and nursing homes are refusing to be guinea pigs in what are experimental vaccines. They do not have full approval of the FDA. Meanwhile, we'll stay focused on today's topic, which is basically that dynamic between governors and legislatures on limiting the emergency orders that have made chaos of our lives, sabotaged livelihoods over the past year. Nick has a background in politics, mostly in Maine. mostly around drug policy. He helped me and others help Governor Johnson's presidential effort at the Maine Policy Institute and also at the Americans for Prosperity. He's helped the right to work movements. He was involved in a creative My Pay, My Way effort. He's really busy with the legislature. And we're going to hear his update today on the COVID petty tyrant governors. So take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay,
Thank you,
that's
Jeff.
great. Go right ahead. I'm going to give you the screen.
Okay, great. Thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate this time, and for Charles and Jeff to invite me here to present. This is my second presentation to your Freedom Hub, and looking forward to it. Like you said, I've been busy for the last few months working on this. So back in July, I gave my first webinar on the response to the virus that we were seeing here in Maine and a lot of other states. And since then, a lot of my work has grown from that in terms of looking at how the effects on our society and the effects on the economy and our state budget, which we've been dealing with the last couple of weeks. And then to this topic, emergency powers reform, which I think is pertinent for every state. Really, not every state has a perfect emergency powers law, as we'll get into later, that balances individual liberty, that balances the separation of powers appropriately. And as Justice Neil Gorsuch said, the Constitution cannot take a hiatus even in a pandemic. And that really gets down to what I want to impart to you all here, because emergency powers are where these rules and these mandates start and end. So I think it's really important to understand where those come from. And so, just to preface here, so as Charles mentioned, my background is a lot in activism and politics. I started working on campus activism at the University of New Hampshire with Young Americans for Liberty, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, worked in a lot of campaigns, state house, state senate in New Hampshire and Maine. I've worked for candidates and folks in 3 different political parties. I've worked on ballot initiatives, nonprofits, and I think I've really found my home here in the nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank space here at Maine Policy Institute. We're based in the state of Maine, and we work on state level public policy. We don't foray into campaigns because we're a 501c3, we're a nonprofit, we're tax deductible. So we focus on education, we educate the voters, educate legislators, we research public policy, and we advocate on issues for the public, and we also lobby legislators to a certain extent. And so to get into this question here, earlier this year or last year, really almost a year ago, we had a virtual event about emergency powers reform. We were watching how our governor and governors around the country were extending the state of emergency. And this was especially troubling to me personally and to our organization over last summer, since Maine is one of the most dependent states on tourism. We were watching with sort of our hands tied behind our backs, not being able to do anything about our tourism industry just sort of falling apart. And now we're seeing on the other side of it, what the effects of that are. I'll get into a little bit about that in terms of how you, as an observer of politics and someone who's passionate about this, can get involved in your state. So thank you once again for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to any questions that you folks have about this. But I wanted to kick it off. So at Maine Policy Institute, we have a couple different things that we do. We do research and advocacy on our website here, mainepolicy.org, as Jeff showed. We also have the mainewire.com, where we post regular articles on what's happening in Maine. As you can see, a lot of what we have here is about the latest budget showdown. That's its own saga, as well as how we're fighting to reopen schools, or at least let folks get back to in-person learning if they so choose, and expand educational choice in general. So looking back at the past year. So in May, we had an event with 3 lawyers in Maine with 3 different specialties. One was a First Amendment freedom of access request expert. One was more of an expert on municipal issues, and another one was an expert on constitutional law. This guy had actually defended the Trump administration in their suit where the House was trying to get his tax records. So he's a constitutional lawyer and has worked on the federal level. So we had all three of them come in and talk about where this authority came from, how long can it last. As you can see here, these are the highlight videos. So what happens with the business liability, and what's the precedent here, and so I think that we hit on a lot of really good topics. And like I said, this was back in May. So that was where this journey started for us. We were asking the question of, where does the power that our governor in Maine, where does that come from? What does it look like in other states? And how did we get here? So I think it's an important question to ask, and you really have to look back. And that's why I like working in think tanks, because you have the time to really go back and flesh this stuff out. If I could just start the conversation off with a quote from the Federalist Papers, number 47, quote, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." And that's James Madison from Federalist Papers 47, just reminding us what the point of our separation of powers and our Republican form of government is supposed to protect. At the height of this past year, 315 million Americans across 42 states were under stay-at-home orders, and that was in April 2020. That's from our friends at the Pacific Legal Foundation. I'll bring in some other stuff from them as well. But we were watching our governor continually extend the state of emergency every 30 days, even through the summer, where our tourism industry was faltering. We didn't have any recourse. It was very frustrating to see businesses in a rural part of our state not even have an opportunity to attempt to make a living and serve their customers, pay their employees. We were all just sort of forced to get along with this huge usurpation of individual liberty for sort of an unrecognizable gain at this point a year later. So that's where we started off here. So that got us to the question of, what does every state do, and how do we compare? How does Maine compare? And so we endeavored, by the support of our generous donors of Maine Policy Institute and our brilliant network of state think tanks through State Policy Network, we endeavored to score all 50 states' emergency powers laws. And so, over last December or so, I looked through every state's law, picked out a few different criteria that we could grade them on, and developed a scorecard. And like you'll see this map here, this red and blue state map, it's definitely a different type of map than you're used to seeing when you break down states as red or blue. And I thought that was kind of a fun thing about this, because it really doesn't matter what the politics are. And that really goes back to my basic point, is it shouldn't matter what the politics are. You should have a clear process for declaring and extending a state of emergency. That's really the one lesson that I want to impart to everyone based on this policy conversation and this adventure that we've gone on here. So, 2020 showed us how broad these powers can be. We saw it in Maine, we saw it in Michigan, where the governor had a law struck down because she overextended her powers. The Supreme Court said she had delegated powers that were reserved for the legislative branch. So there were serious separation of powers issues. And although, a lot of these emergency powers laws were crafted in the Cold War era, maybe they were altered a little bit after 9/11 in 2001, and maybe altered a little bit after SARS-1 or MERS or some of these other sort of smaller global pandemics that we've seen in the last 20 years or so. A lot of these state emergency powers laws really hadn't been tweaked too much. And at any rate, they all include very broad language to deal with any natural or man-made emergency. Every state's a little bit different. When you look through these, some of them have formulaic language a little bit. But I thought it was interesting that, in a lot of cases, these states have similarly broad powers for the governor. The real difference is the process by which legislators and the governor himself or herself can declare a state of emergency and effectively give themselves these broad powers. So going back to precedent, Supreme Court precedent from over 100 years ago in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, when the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, implemented a mandatory vaccination program. A pastor, this man Jacobson, stood up and said, "No, I'm not going to participate in this." So he sued the state. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state, deferring to the Massachusetts legislature and agreeing with them that Mr. Jacobson did not have an equal protection violation because it's within the state's police power. So this is not specifically delegated to emergency powers. It doesn't flow from emergency powers, but it's the general precedent that states have broad police powers under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, whereby any power not vested in the federal government is imparted to the states. So that generally means that states can craft their own emergency management plans by statute, and they are generally deferred. The courts generally defer to the legislature in those realms. So that's kind of the background of this. So to give you a sense of how this broke down, I'm going to bring up the map so it's a little more interactive here. But the 5 categories that I picked out, looking at every state's emergency powers process, I figured that it was the most important to look at how are emergencies declared, how are they extended, and how are they terminated. So it's important when we're looking at the broad powers that are given to a lot of governors and state executives. Do they get to determine when the circumstances arise when they get these broad powers? Is it solely up to them? How involved is the legislature in this process? And at what point should they be? And what's the ideal? And so looking at this sort of helped us shape that and get a better sense of what a more ideal emergency powers law would be. So folks can find this page at mainepolicy.org. And there's this interactive map here that we made with Flourish. And you can see the score down at the bottom of this box and the 5 different criteria. So the first 2 are weighted double. So if you look at the other 3, it deals with time limits in terms of how long between each emergency declaration does a governor have to redeclare or extend the state of emergency to keep going. How long do their powers continue after they're terminated? And what is the breadth of their authority in terms of altering or suspending, amending rules, regulations, and statutes? So when you look at those 3, to me, that they weren't as important as the process by which emergencies are declared and terminated. Just looking at it in the way of, in the sake of Maine, yes, we have a 30-day emergency declaration time limit, but the only mechanism by which the legislature can end a state of emergency is by affirmatively passing a joint resolution to terminate it. So thereby, if there's no mechanism for that, if there's no interest in the legislature for that, emergency can extend in perpetuity as long as the political consequences or the political landscape stays the same. Just putting Maine in perspective, we're not the worst. We're certainly not the best, as you can see, but there were about a quarter of the states have a law where the governor is the sole determinant of whether an emergency exists. And so I'll highlight Vermont because it got the worst score. And not that because it has a much more egregious process, the fact that it has a process where the governor is the sole arbiter of whether an emergency exists or ends, that alone in itself is problematic. And like I said, there's a quarter of the states deal with that. But what put Vermont at the bottom of the barrel here was the fact that any executive order regarding energy transmission or the environment can last up to 6 months after the official termination of the state of emergency. And to me, that's extremely problematic, obviously, for a lot of reasons. Executive order and executive authority is something that should have safeguards on it. And, like I'll mention later on, emergency powers are there for short-term emergencies. I don't think any legislator in the country over the course of however many years legislators have been crafting this thought that their emergency powers law would be used for a year or more. it's a really fascinating thing to look up. We haven't been able to dig into the legislative library here in Maine, but that's where you'd have to go. You'd have to go and bring up the debates back then and see what they were talking about. And I'm not a betting man, but I might put some money on guessing that they didn't think that a state of emergency could last for a year reasonably. So that's what we've been talking about here. And I think that should give every person, every American, pause about what their laws mean and how their governor exercises it. Unfortunately, it really mattered who your governor was this year. So those are those 5 categories that I was looking at here. To round this out, Vermont got the worst score, like I mentioned, because their orders last for a while. The highest scores came from Kansas and South Carolina, which both require a legislative concurrence vote every 15 days. So the governor has to go back to the legislature, get an affirmative vote by a majority to extend their state of emergency. The thing that's interesting about Kansas that brought them to the top spot is that the legislature may only approve one 30-day extension, but subsequent extensions after that, every 30 days, have to be through a unanimous vote of the State Finance Council, which is a smaller group. So albeit not as diffuse as the full legislature, which would be ideal if we're talking about balancing power and diffusing power. But it is another safeguard and an extra step, and that time limit was small enough. So in the rubric, they got the first score. I will say, and I will go over other reforms that we're seeing in the country today, it will be really interesting to see the second edition of this. This is our first edition to put this out. First time we tackled this, but I'm looking forward to doing it all in the next end of this year and seeing where it changes, seeing what states got better, what states got worse. And I'm hopeful that folks, think tanks and legislators in different states can utilize this to make some hay and to really frame the discussion about what their emergency powers law means. Because when you really think about it, all of these restrictions, all of these business orders, these curfews, they all flow from this emergency powers law. So that's sort of the frame that I want to bring here. The worst states: Vermont, Washington, Ohio, Hawaii, Arizona. These are all the worst because the governor is the only one that gets to determine whether an emergency exists. And so you look at that and they see this whole section of law that allows them to control the egress and ingress of the emergency area, which is of course the whole state. You can just see how broad these powers are. And I'm fairly certain that they really had not been used to this extent until this year. So that brings us to, what's the ideal law? How do we get to an emergency powers law that actually maintains separation of powers, allows the legislature a co-equal branch, and even in an emergency, even in a crisis, especially in a long-term crisis like we're facing today, and how does it adequately protect liberty? So our good friends at the Pacific Legal Foundation, they had some really great stuff here. I worked with their team to review this, as well as think tanks from around the country to sort of check my work as we went on. But Pacific Legal Foundation, I got to give them a special shout out because they have done some great work tracking the bills that are being reformed and putting out some model legislation. And so, using what we saw here in Maine and our frustrations and sort of working with our legislators here, we developed, some bills for them. They actually all got a hearing on Monday, all 14 bills to reform emergency powers here on Monday. Not sure how those will shake out, but the more the merrier is what we said. I'll just throw it all at the wall and see what sticks. But breaking down what would be the most balanced, let's say, emergency protocol, it really requires full legislative oversight. And that means that, an ideal situation is going to be, no matter who the governor is, no matter what the political makeup of the legislature, there should be a clear process by which an emergency is declared and extended. And when I say a clear process, it's got to be the same thing every time. So it shouldn't matter who your governor is. It shouldn't matter the politics of the situation. They should have to come back every so often, whether it be 30 days or 14 days or 7 days or 5 days or whatever, they should come back to the legislature and present the facts, have a debate, and get a vote by the people. And if necessary, hold some hearings. This is the point of our process, is that it's a self-governing process, and the hearing and public input as a part of that is crucial. And so we cannot forget the fact that we have separation of powers, and we have co-equal branches of government, even in an emergency. And so that goes under the legislative oversight. There's got to be some oversight on the ability to extend emergencies. There also, I think, should be an ability for the legislature to provide oversight on specific executive orders. A few states have some language that allows the legislature to do that, to nullify specific executive orders with a certain vote. This was something that I had been talking about a few months ago over the holiday season, when our governor instituted a curfew for service workers and service industry businesses, bars and restaurants and whatnot, at 9 p.m. So ultimately, what we were seeing was, the state taking wages away from folks who needed to work after that, and really not affecting the virus at all. Obviously, I think it's clear that none of these state mandates or rules or curfews or mask mandates or whatever else really has an effect on viral spread. But that's sort of the state that we're in right now, with the presumption of liberty and the presumption of scientific knowledge, is that if it doesn't work, then we got to keep trying, because it hasn't been tried hard enough. So the other side of this ideal balanced law would be the judicial review aspect. So you have this idea where the legislature needs to check the executive on their orders and on their declarations, but you also need to ascribe a certain standard for the courts to hear these challenges. So that means that by strict scrutiny here, what I mean is that by requiring every emergency order by the governor, and that's an important part, is that any emergency order should be written by the governor, or at least signed off by the governor, versus just the public health secretary or the public health director, as is the case in some states that have gone on this year. Strict scrutiny means that every order needs to be narrowly tailored in order to fulfill a specific health and safety, a compelling health and safety purpose. So by doing that, by enshrining that in law, you're directing the courts to really measure the potential harm to individual liberty against the state's interest. And by requiring the state to show a compelling interest that what they're doing protects health and safety, and also that it needs to be narrowly tailored to fit that goal, it really puts the individual liberty of folks sort of equal to the state. And so with the combination of these things, requiring strict scrutiny and requiring the courts to give these orders, these challenges to these orders, expedited review, that's the way for the legislature to tell the courts that, no, this is really important. It's not just a political question for the courts to say, oh, the legislature already dealt with this. It's not necessary for us to deal with it. That's why the people have their legislators. They've already made the laws. No reason for us to step in here. By the legislators ascribing that specifically in law, it tells the courts to measure these against individual liberty and to hear them as quickly as possible. These are the really core tenets of a balanced, separate, diffuse power process that we need in emergency powers. And so that's got to be the basis of any reform. And we've been working with states around the country for that. And I want to sort of impart some lessons for folks of the way that this talk was framed was, how can you get involved? How can you push back against your governors? And for me, maybe I'm biased, but I think you got to go to your state think tanks. They're leading the way by writing and analyzing and really relating these problems. They have the time to dig into the law, to dig into the origins of the law. And in some cases, they have the resources to sue the state. Mackinac Center in Michigan led the way on that lawsuit against Gretchen Whitmer. And in New York State Empire Center, their think tank, they filed the first Freedom of Information request based on that nursing home data. So they were the impetus for releasing that data. And so I would urge folks to go check out the State Policy Network directory, find the think tank in your state, reach out to them and get involved and see what they're doing on this. If you listen back to my previous Your Freedom Hub webinar, I provided some sort of lessons for state think tanks to deal with this year and this moment that we're having, because I really think it's an important part of the policy ecosystem to be the ones to make the case for liberty, to make the case for needing some really strong accountability measures, even in a state of emergency. I think that's what it's about. Just being a think tank, you're not a politician, you're not a political party. So it's important to make those principled cases in order to give some other folks cover in your ecosystem. What I said was get out ahead of this, try to make the case for the most freedom possible, and review your governor's powers, and that's what we did. So that's how we ended up with this. To sort of fast forward to this week, our think tank, Maine Policy Institute, we made a form for folks to email the committee to enter testimony in support of the 14 bills to reform our emergency powers law this week. We sent over 1,500 emails to legislators. And I think by having some good technological tools and a strong email list, you can really help folks get out ahead of this, understand it, and get involved. And I think any measure of folks getting out there and reaching out to their legislators, state legislators aren't used to getting 15, 20 emails on something. So when it happens, they take notice. So I don't want to underestimate the power of that. But looking at what are the good lessons here and how can you really get involved? I think to me it's about making the abstract of these policies relatable. And so we've tried to do that in our COVID catastrophe video series, which we just dropped the second one today. This one that I have up here is a screenshot of our first one where on the left, Trey Stewart, he's a state senator up in Aroostook County, which is a very rural part of Maine, borders Canada. It's the largest county east of the Mississippi by geography. And he's speaking with John Ellis, the owner of the Ellis Family Market. And he's talking about the effects of the pandemic on their community, on their business at large. There's another video where Trey is driving around and just pointing out the different businesses that have gone out of business over this year. And so that's part of where I want to go with this. There are so many stories out there of folks who have lost a business, whose children have suffered from lack of in-school learning, lack of social interaction. That we just heard from a woman this last couple of days where she was leading physical exercise in an assisted living home. She found that wearing a mask continually was causing her other health problems. Her doctor recommended she not wear a mask because she was getting lack of oxygen to her brain. Like I said, she was leading physical activity for folks in an assisted living home. So our governor's mask mandate, another asinine order that our legislature cannot specifically deal with, it provides no exception or exemption for folks with a disability for the mask mandate. And so you find folks like this woman who has been in limbo in the unemployment system trying to find a job that she's able to work without wearing a mask. And lo and behold, there are none because this mandate is truly universal. So we have someone who is healthy, who was helping her community, who was financially steady and sustainable. And now she's out of work and she's continually in the unemployment situation, literally because of our governor's heavy-handed mandate. It's been reckless. So this is the lesson that I want to impart to folks, is really try to make these stories relatable. Put out ads. These think tanks are great because you can put out requests for stories, and there are so many stories out there. So we put a little bit behind this and reached out to these folks and made some videos about them. We're really excited about the other videos that are coming out in this series because people just don't. You all know what I'm talking about. People don't see the other costs of what's happened here. We've completely forgot about a cost-benefit analysis in our policy with this. And, it all comes back to these emergency orders. how broad is your emergency powers law? What sort of accountability mechanisms do the legislature or the people through the legislature have to manage this? And that's where it comes from. That's where it begins and ends. So if we have a more lockdown process, if we have a more restrictive process for the state, it means we can guarantee more liberty for folks on the end. This is something that we're really trying to focus on and really drive home those stories, because it's so important. That's how you relate to folks on an empathetic level. So that's just something I want to bring ahead. This is the map that I've been working on, trying to track different bills in different state legislatures to reform emergency power. As you can see, the orange are the ones that are still pending. Green are those that have passed. And so if you can see all the way on the eastern side, Pennsylvania voters will be voting on a constitutional amendment to deal with this, to pass this bill in May. The Kentucky legislature overrode their governor's veto to pass their emergency powers reform bill. And just a couple weeks ago, the Ohio Senate overrode the governor's veto of their bill. Honestly, looking for this, if I'll go back to the previous map, Ohio had one of the worst laws. There was almost no real prescribed emergency plan outside of, the governor kind of gets to decide what it is, and to the point where the public health official, the public health director, could just initiate these orders, these emergency orders. So that's why it's so important to have reforms where just the governor or the governor has to be at least a party to these orders, so that there's some elected official that the blame sort of falls on, and to restrict that person in their ability to make orders is so important. So this is an interactive one as well. This is just for our sort of internal use to try to track it, but there are a lot that have come up and gone down as dead. But I think that this has really raised, and I hope it has raised the conversation. We had a piece published in National Review about this earlier in the year, and with Governor Cuomo and Whitmer and Murphy and Newsom and all of these crazy governors with their heads in the sand, not seeing the science, not seeing the data, but still persisting on their mitigation strategies, if we can even call them that. I think it's important to really look back at where this comes from, and it really starts with emergency powers reform. So if I can impart anything to this group, is that reach out to your state think tank, get involved, make sure that you know who your legislators are, and we can really force this issue with a dozen emails to a state legislative committee. I think it's overlooked in terms of how involved you can be on the local level. So that's probably the one lesson that I'd try to impart here. But I know that we only have about 15 minutes left, but I'm glad to answer any questions about this. I want to thank Charles and Jeff for the opportunity to share this work and to share what we do at Maine Policy Institute. Please check out our websites and our Twitter handles here, as well as the mainwire.com. That's our news site. And you can contact me at either of these two, the email or Twitter up top. But thank you guys, and I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, great, Nick. That was very, very good. And it's nice how you guys have, been trying to create a public face to this, because obviously without the empathy, it's going to go zero. No one wants to read your white paper. And at the same time, most importantly, is that you create this tool that really kind of forces the spirit of the Constitution is to have some way to hold people accountable, especially across these 50 different states. The whole idea of that being a experiment. How do we know what they're doing? So this is really good that you've zeroed on something like this, so we can all get behind in that regard. So let's get some questions going here. And I know Charles had one for you there, if he unmutes himself. Well, while I'm waiting for him to pop in, I did have one too, but I was going to give him the first swing at it. Put it in a little historical perspective. Why suddenly did all these states need to have these emergency powers, as it were? And why is there such a dramatic difference between them? I mean, what was going on at the time or in that climate that some states felt it had to be so draconian and the others are, as you've seen, more sensible about it?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that when these things were being crafted, and not every state dealt with theirs at the same time, but I did find some themes where a lot of them came into play in the Cold War, like I mentioned, and then were sort of tweaked later. I think it was sort of an overlooked aspect of it was the process by which emergencies are declared and extended. I think, largely if you look at these, a lot of the governors have the same sorts of broad emergency powers that others do, but the difference is how involved their legislators are. And so, I think that there are some states where I think it's just the character of the state. Maybe Arizona and Hawaii, they have certain things where, a military attack provides for certain things, and you can see how maybe historical context had crafted certain aspects of their emergency powers laws, but I think it was overlooked a bit, and that's why you sort of see this smattering of different states with different gradients of accountability.
Very good. Kishore?
Hi. So my question is, Michigan Governor Whitmer, she actually ignored the order that was passed by the state Supreme Court. It seems like there's no consequence for the decisions that you take by leveraging your emergency powers, which I kind of find very strange. So
Yeah,
are there no penalties for overlooking such guidance from the Supreme Court?
it's a great question. Michigan is a a funny case, I think, because they had two conflicting emergency powers laws. And of course, Governor Whitmer, she initially uses the 1970s law, the one that's still in effect today, because that was sort of the precedent. And then when she realized that, oh, this one requires me to have legislative approval, well, I can use this other one that's still on the books, and I don't need legislative approval. Thankfully, the Supreme Court saw that and said, well, there's a reason why we have this one. You can't delegate legislative power. The chief executive can't make law through emergency orders. And so, I think it's important, and there are some bills that we have here in Maine that would impose some kind of penalty and make it a crime or an impeachable offense, at least, for a governor to infringe on some of these orders. But that has to be in the law as well, or else, you can sue a governor in their official capacity, but it ends up just coming down to a constitutional question, and we're back in the same place. But if the statute is clear, like I said, with having these orders be narrowly tailored, if the statute is clear about that aspect, as well as the legislative oversight aspect, then it's much easier for the courts to make this case. And I think that the fact that a lot of these have been glossed over for the last few decades and not really weeded through, I think that's why we see some of the confusion. But that's just another thing that states can implement, is making sure that there are consequences for governors or other political officials who flout the rules like this. So here's hoping. But that's why everyone needs to be involved here.
Charles?
Nick, hi. Jeff, sorry about being muted before. Have you gotten involved with some of the scientific arguments? For example, CDC just issued a report allegedly supporting their draconian mask orders over the past year, but when looked into more closely, the data showed really only a 1% reduction in cases from their masking order. In that same study, they claimed huge case increases from reopening restaurants. But again, looking into the data, the increase in cases from reopening restaurants was only 1% increase. So basically, they sabotaged our livelihoods over nothing. Do you get into any of that controversy over the corruption in science? I mean, let's be honest about it. The PCR test using accelerated thresholds that really show any kind of virus, but not really infection. Every single one of their orders has had questionable science backing it. Has that been part of your discussion at all?
It has, in terms of our state's response. I should be clear that this project, in terms of measuring states' emergency powers and scoring the laws, we're just scoring the statutes themselves and not the response of the governor. And I think that that really plays the idea that this shouldn't be about politics. It shouldn't matter whether your governor is Ron DeSantis or Gavin Newsom. Your legislature should have the same involvement every step of the way. And so, that's something that I've been outspoken about in my writings on the Maine Wire, and certain things that we've done, really trying to bring up and cause more awareness around our governor's orders and how they are not helping folks get through this and not helping the virus and things like that. And so, I try to, but in terms of this case, this case study, it's really about just scoring the statutes. I should mention one thing. Rick Essenberg from the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, another great state-based think tank, he had some good advice a few months ago when I heard him speaking. And it's hard for these state think tanks and for policy folks to argue epidemiology. And as tempting as it is, and especially for someone like myself who's seeing the science and seeing that science has really been perverted on a political level and has been politicized, it's hard not to talk about that. But I think it is more relatable and more powerful for the everyday person if you focus on the orders and the restrictions and the fact that they're not applied equally, they're not enforced equally, and that the fact that there are so many unintended consequences. So you don't even have to really dip into the science to get there, because it's really tough to argue epidemiology with a state public health expert in terms of the public credibility. But the fact that they've just completely ignored the consequences of these things, I think is reason enough to push those forward and put those consequences, put the economic and social consequences ahead here and lay out the cost benefit analysis, because normal people recognize that.
I know that you're not trying to be political, which is a good thing, because obviously you just want to look at the statutes. But as these ones are reforming these states like Ohio that you mentioned, has there been any trend based on the political alignments of those states, the ones that seem to be moving faster or more interested in fixing themselves?
It's interesting. I would say that the states, I'll pull up the map here again, but the states that have made the most progress, I think, are the ones that are maybe more Republican leaning states, like you can see here, but a lot of them have sort of gone different routes. I mean, for instance, in Idaho, there were Republican representatives fighting the governor on this, and the governor the governor makes the case that, no, I need these powers to be nimble and everything else. So you have other states where the Democratic majority are going against their governor, like in New York and Hawaii and New Mexico and other places. A good friend, Jason Mercier at Washington Policy Center and Olympia Watch in Washington, has been keeping track of a lot of this stuff. And he's found a lot of great quotes from Democratic representatives against Democratic governors. I can't say that those states are moving quicker. I think that it's clear from this map that, states that are more conservative are moving more to reform, or at least the bills have better chance of passing there. But also it's going to take looking at the first edition of the scorecard and seeing how which states have enacted reforms and where they go from there. It has been interesting to see how the political dynamic changes what happens, but I think we've seen it from both sides, and to me that's a good thing. Not everyone is beholden to politics, even though it seems like that sometimes.
No, that is encouraging news. Charles, I see your hand again.
What about the dynamic of vaccine passports that might lead people of both political persuasions, right and left, to let the emergency orders end and open up? After all, if everyone's vaccinated, people should have less fear. That's as their argument goes. But those passports basically are, a civil rights attack on people who don't follow the dominant medical paradigm. They're going to have to get the passport or lose their ability to hold down a job or travel or shop. That's going to present a big libertarian argument. Have you guys broached that issue yet?
We have not yet. I think it's definitely a big issue in terms of the presumption of liberty that folks deserve, Americans deserve from their government. I think it's going to be really tough to enforce that sort of thing equally. And I think that's why the Biden administration has indicated that they are going to try to move through the private sector, or at least incentivize the private sector to move towards this sort of thing. As a libertarian, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with a business, determining who it serves, and if it helps, their customers feel more comfortable. That's their choice. But at the same token, it's my choice as a customer to not give those businesses any of my money, which I plan on doing, and I plan on fighting any perceived vaccine passport that's going to come up. Like you mentioned, I think it does sort of discriminate against the folks who may have any number of objections or reasons not to take the vaccine, and I don't think there's anything wrong with any of those. And it also puts the folks that have a natural immunity at a sort of second class status as well, because how do natural immunity is just as good as vaccine immunity. There's studies over and out that say that. And so how do you reason that out with a vaccine passport? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem enforceable, and it definitely doesn't seem constitutional. But like I said, a private business can incentivize that sort of thing. It's going to get hairy when it starts to, if it ever trickles into travel and things like that. But I'm just speculating. It's a really slippery slope. I hope it never gets to that, but we'll be speaking out against it for sure if it ever comes to it.
Yeah, hopefully everybody will be on that one, because you're right. That was what I was going to mention. The minute it spills into the right to travel, now it's going to be really intense.
Yeah.
And we just had somebody on the show that was, multi-generational, never vaccinated families. Well, what about them? That's their whole goal, is to never be, and because they were showing much better health outcomes. Sadly, some of us have had vaccines over the years when we were kids or whatever, and here they're really doing great. What's going to happen to those poor people?
Yeah, it's got to be a different thing than a like they call a yellow card for yellow fever if you're traveling to certain countries. This is going to be something that's much more beyond that, and I don't think that's a reasonable equivocation to make between those things. We're talking about something very different.
Quite. All right. Well, we've got time for like one last little question, if we can squeak one in here. I want to see if anybody had anything last to throw at you there. But one thing we'll definitely make sure is we put both of those sites in the credits so that everyone can tap into both those things that you guys have happening for sure. And we're going to want to kind of stay updated as we have been. It'll be neat to see, like you said, with that perspective, now that you've been doing this, how these states improve and how that map changes. And then, of course, there's always that hopeful domino theory that, if you make the move and the next thing you know, everybody else is saying, hey. So that's a great bipartisan situation we see there. So that's great.
Absolutely. I think we've seen the power of folks moving with their feet, and that's just going on vacation this year. Florida has exploded in terms of economic power and economic growth, just from being open and being one of the only states that's open that has stuff going on. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how folks vote with their feet in that way if this becomes one of those deciding issues.
And those that are trying to say, hey, to what they're doing there, I'm going to go there and give them some of my business, because they could have readily just gone somewhere else. But I said, no, you know what? I'm going to reward those people for this good behavior. So very good. Well, listen, Nick, this was great. I appreciate you spending some quality time with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.